Hello friends, SentinalhMC here, and welcome back to our Applied Energistics tutorial. In this episode, we're going to talk about cable types, and we're also going to go over channels. This is our primer on the way that channels work in Applied Energistics 2. We're not going to get into some of the advanced stuff. P2P tunnels will come in a future video, and we'll go into much more depth on things like subnetworks in a future episode. But this is going to be our primer on channels, what they are, how they work, and what you need to know in order to create more advanced ME systems. So the first thing we're going to do is go over the 3 different types of cables that we haven't currently talked about. We already know about the glass cable. These are covered cables, smart cables, and dense cables. And you're going to need these over at the end, dense cables, in order to get the most out of your ME system. But you're probably also going to want smart cables for troubleshooting. So the first one, the covered cable, is very simple to craft. All you need is a piece of ME glass cable and a piece of wool. So we are going to need quite a bit of wool. Once you have your covered cable crafted, it's alliteration for you, you can dye it any color that you want by simply placing a piece of dye in the middle and surrounding it with bits of covered cable. So I've currently got the non-dyed version, which is Fluix, which looks like this. The next thing we have is the smart cable. Now, the smart cable is cool, and we'll see how that works in a moment. But it's crafted simply by taking a piece of covered cable and adding a redstone dust and a glowstone dust. And that gives you an ME smart cable, and you color it the same way as the covered cable. And it's got this big black line down the center, and you'll see what that's for in a minute. Then you have dense cable, which is a bit expensive. It's an advanced cable. It is needed to get the most out of your ME systems. The dense cable is crafted with 4 covered cables. You're going to want them to be undyed. And then a redstone dust and a glowstone dust. Okay, and that gives you 1 block of dense cable. All right, so it is expensive. It's 4 cables per block rather than 1. So, yeah. But you are going to need it. And if you want to remove the dye that you've applied to any of these cables, just craft it with a bucket of water. Okay, so now that we've got these different kinds of cables, we're going to focus in on what the smart cable and the dense cable do for us in managing our channels. So, first of all, we have over here a creative energy cell just so we can power everything. And we've got some of this ME smart cable pulled out. Now, what smart cable does is it lets you see at a glance, how many channels are being used. Okay, so what are channels? Everything in Applied Energistics, all the machines, all the things like interfaces, export and import buses, ME drives, inscribers, and everything, ME chests, everything that needs data requires a channel. I believe even including terminals. Yep. So you're going to need... So everything uses channels, all right? By default, without a ME controller, the cable has 8 channels, okay? So you can place 8 things on a piece of standard cable. So if I grab like these export buses and I just start lining them up, we're currently using 4 of 8 channels, and the smart cable shows that we're connected to the thing, but if we cut that off, we won't be connected, and you can see that we still have 4 of 8 channels being used all across the line. Once you get to 8, you can't add any more, and the smart cable shows you how many is in use by these little lines, which is why it can be very useful to have a piece or 2 of smart cable in your system so that you can tell how many you're using. If I add another one, you can see that we now have a nice bright pink line, and if we keep adding more, we'll get to 8. Now, we're currently using 8 of 8 channels. If I add another device, oh no, they all turned off. So we've overloaded the number of channels, and now nothing that's on this line works. The little pink light on these things means they're currently not working. If we break it off, you can see that these turn dark blue, and now things are working again. The lights are on, and it'll be functional. So that's what smart cable does for us, and it'll be very important to have at least a couple of pieces of that so that you can tell what the heck's going on. Now, To illustrate these channels a bit more, we're going to go to our little ME controller here, and we're going to place 4 of these buses, 8. Now we have 8 buses, and once it updates, we can tell a couple of things about this. The first thing we can see is that unlike before, when we weren't connected to the controller, the buses, the channels in use are not solid all the way across. It's showing us that we're using 2 of 8 at the end, we're using 4 of 8 up there, 6 of 8, and then all 8. So when you have it connected to a controller, it'll show you how many channels that you're using on each individual section by the time you get down to the end. And you know, we can totally, if I were to break this and place it back, and I was to like pull this off to the side a bit, you can see we're currently using 0 of 8 channels. However, if I add a bus here, you can see that we're now using 1 of 8 channels here, and up here we're using 5. Okay? Now that might be a little confusing, but essentially these are nested. You can nest these things, and they will use these channels. The important bit is that it doesn't matter how many of these nested things we have, and whether this says it's using 2 and this says it's using 1. As soon as this one up here connected to the controller hits 8, and we drop another thing on, isn't something gonna turn? Yeah, something's gonna turn off. Okay? It's not all gonna turn off, but something's gonna turn off. In this case, this one at the end here turn off. Device missing channel. Okay? And if I go ahead and I add another one here, you can see that this one just turned off. If I add another one here, something turned off. This one turned off. Okay? So as you overload your cable, more and more of these will begin to turn off and not function. Okay? And it proceeds from the end and comes up. Now, if I keep adding them onto this little branch here, it's not going to work. This branch is completely overloaded. Okay? If I want to overload this side, I need to add more over here. Now we're starting to overload this thing, and on this branch, and that's turning off. Okay? So the main gist of this is that if you don't have enough channels, the stuff won't work. Okay? But we can fix this. The controller block, being the most important block in your network, outputs 8 channels per side. Not in total. Per side. So this cable connected to this side is getting 8 channels off of the side of this block. Because we're using a standard cable, we have 8 channels off of the side of this block. If I place some cable here, it says 0 of 8 channels. And if we go in and we connect this together, does this work? No, it doesn't. I didn't think so. If we go over here and we connect it to that and we delete that, now it works. Except for this stuff out here, because we added too many channels. Okay, can you see? This didn't used to be on because we were overloading the channels that were coming out of this side of the controller. But because we're now running this stuff off of the top of the controller, where it has 8 more channels, we have enough channels to power and utilize these things. Okay, now we're going to get rid of these. And we're going to talk about dense cable, because the controller is capable of outputting far more channels than simply 8 per side. Okay, dense cable, if you look at that Wayla tooltip at the bottom, has 32 channels. Okay, so now I've got some dense cable running down this like backbone. I've got some strips of smart cable coming out the sides. If I start loading these up with export buses, you'll notice some things. Just like over there, we're currently using 7 of 8. I gotta add another thing back on. We're currently using 8 of 8 channels at the front, And we're doing the same thing over here. However, if we look at the dense cable, we're only using 8 of 32, which only gives us 2 lines. Okay? If we load up this cable and use 8 channels there, we're using 16 channels off this dense cable. And we can keep doing this. We can load up this wire with 8 buses or whatever the heck else you want to add on to this thing. And now we're using 8 channels there, we're using 8 channels here, and we're using 24 channels over here. Okay, we can load this one up. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and we're currently using 8 of 8 channels here. We're using 16 of 32 channels right here, and we're using all 32 channels on this cable. Do you see how it kind of works here? This cable is reporting the number of channels that are currently in use downstream from the controller. Okay, so on this cable that only includes these 2 branches, which are using 16 channels. However, this wire is reporting all the channels that are in use downstream from the controller as well, so it has to report all 4 of these. And of course, if we start adding more stuff onto this entire line, it'll start using more channels than the 32 that this is outputting, and we will end up shutting some of these things down. Okay, so if I was to go ahead and add another export bus onto this, it simply would not fire up because there aren't enough channels. Okay, and if we added another one onto this, then it wouldn't fire up because there's not enough channels. If we added something onto the dense cable, you can see it doesn't actually work. You can't attach devices directly to dense cable. You need to first attach a smart cable or a covered cable. You need to attach some type of smaller cable before you can start attaching things to dense cable. Now, when I plugged that in, you'll notice that it actually fired up and it started using 1 channel off of this dense cable. It didn't not work. Okay? Instead, what happened is that this one turned off. I assume because it's further downstream. If I plug another one in, we'll see another one turns off. And if I keep doing this, okay, no more. Okay, then this one turned off. Okay, so it's turning them off that are the ones that are furthest away from the actual controller. See, the ones where they were using 2 channels, they got shut off first. So keep that in mind. The stuff that's the furthest away from your controller will get shut off first if you start overloading the system closer to the controller. Now if I break this off, you'll notice that they turn back on. Not this one because we added that as an extra one earlier, but you can see that they're all back on except for the extra one, and we're good now. I hope that this kind of makes sense. So because you can place a dense cable on each side, you can get quite a lot of channels out of this thing. If we go up into the air a bit with an ME controller, you can see we could add dense cable on all sides. Okay. Now it's important to note that stuff like this battery don't use channels because it's just providing power. It's not using any data. So you could plug in creative energy cells and other things like that. If they're not drawing data, they don't use channels. But you can see 32 channels, 32 channels, 32, 32. 32 times 6 for a total of 192 channels that you can get from a single controller block if you can plug into all sides. Okay? Much, much more than if you don't use dense cable and you're only using this smaller cable, because then you'll only get 8 times 6, which I didn't actually do the math for. Now, I want to briefly talk about the idea of sub-channels. We're going to go into this in greater detail in a future video when I show you how to fully automate the inscriber system. But I'm going to show you briefly what I'm talking about when I say sub-channels. So sub-networks, I mean. So I have an ME cable coming out this side of the controller, currently 0 of 8 channels in use. Now, I can plug 8 things into this. But what if I want this to what if I want more than 8 things plugged into this? But I don't necessarily need to use a dense cable, right? Now, this is especially useful when you're interacting with other mods. Let's say I wanted to attach, or when you're creating stuff. This is the type of system I'm going to set up in probably the next video when I show you how to fully automate the inscriber. It takes quite a few inscribers, and it takes quite a few other things. It would take quite a lot of channels in order to do it. However, we can trick the system. Well, not trick it, but we can utilize the system to give ourselves more processing power while using fewer channels. If I place an interface onto this cable, it's using 1 of 8 channels. Now, if you remember in our previous episode, the interface allows you to do a couple of things. It can store crafting patterns for the auto crafting system, which we'll have to talk about soon. Well, actually, we have to talk about the auto crafting system before we talk about the inscribers. But you can put crafting patterns in here, because if you put a crafting update in there, I assume. And what the interface will do is it will request items from the network for use in crafting recipes. We can use this to our advantage. Let's say we want to have a big line of machines that from other mods or inscribers that we can craft stuff with. But we don't want to use all of our channels on this cable. The interface, if we do a little bit of funny stuff, if we stick an interface onto this interface, okay, and then I run some, let's grab my smart cable, some smart cable down here, you'll notice that this says 1 of 8 channels. Now, the line isn't lit up because there's no power. Quartz fiber, if you remember from our video about quartz with quartz fiber in it, passes power, but not data. So, if I use a cable, and you wouldn't use a smart cable for this, and I plug it in on this side of our interface, which has power, you can see that this side now is powered. Okay? Now what we can do is we can attach things. We'll just attach some storage buses for the purposes of this. But imagine you had some machines attached to these storage buses, or maybe you had some export buses on some machines, and then you had an import bus on something. Okay, we're currently at 7 of 8 channels because of our interface. Now, you can see that over here, where we have our storage buses and our import bus and our export buses for some sort of processing system, we're using 7 channels. If we go over to our main line, we're still only using 1 channel. This over here is not actually connected to our controller. Okay? It's considered a subnetwork because no data can be passed from the stuff over here directly to the controller. Rather, what happens here is that items can go from the main system through the interface to our system over here, and items can come from over here, go use this interface as a buffer, go into this interface, and go back into the main storage system. By using subnetworks, you can extract far more processing capacity from even the 192 channels that we have. Essentially, you can have up to, really, 8 subnetworks on this one cable, each containing quite a lot of other processing components. Now, I really hope that this part of the video doesn't confuse you, and we will talk about subnetworks in greater detail in the future, so that hopefully it's more explained. But I just want this channels episode to give you an overview of the channels system, how you use it, and that you really shouldn't be worried about it. Because there are so many tricks to getting enough channels for what you're doing that you really never have to worry about running out of channels. I mean, if you really have to, you can just plonk another controller down and get even another 192 channels. Okay? So let me know in the comments. I hope I didn't confuse anybody, but the important thing to remember with channels is that by default, these cables only have 8 channels for use, and if you overload them, stuff starts not working. By using dense cable, you can get up to 32 channels per side on your controller. And if you start to overload the channels, the items will start turning off the furthest away from the controller. Alright? Okay, so I hope that this was helpful when it comes to channels. Let me know in the comments if this did confuse you. If you have questions, I will help answer them in the comments. I don't want anyone to be confused. In our next episode, we're going to go over the auto-crafting capabilities of the mod, and we will talk about fully automating the inscriber, either in that video or in the next video after that. So, I'm SentinalH. Stay tuned for future videos, and I'm signing out.